They told me the parcel had been abandoned for decades. The file on my tablet called it vacant, a line item for appraisal and containment, a box to tick in a long string of rural properties with collapsed roofs and ivy-choked chimneys. I expected brambles and toppled stone, a place where roofs had been reclaimed by the sky. I did not expect rooftops, neat, intact, dark against the dusk, lined like teeth along a hollow road, as if the town had simply decided to sleep and left its doors unlocked. From the ridge, the settlement looked deliberate. Window panes were clean where dust should have layered. Lines of laundry hung without a breeze, flapping with a rhythm that suggested hands beyond the porches had just tugged them taut. There was no modernity, no antennae, no wires, no satellite dishes. The road in was patched, as if someone kept it honest. People moved, small and domestic against the gathering blue. A man tightening a line, a woman sweeping with slow, exact strokes, a child balancing a basin. They moved as if performing a choreographed memory. When I turned on my radio and then my phone, habit, not hope, there was nothing, not even the weak bar that clings to every hollow like lint. Is it really empty? I asked the valley out loud, at first to test the phrase and then because asking it felt like a professional duty. The question landed in my throat as an instrument case might land on a table. Simple, useful. The valley did not answer. It let the town hum. I parked where the road grew skeptical, where gravel gave way to beaten dirt, and took my kit, camera, tablet, measuring wheel, field notebook, things that make unknowns become graphs and lists. For 2 decades I had been hired to reduce ghost towns to checklists. Safety hazards, potential for redevelopment, time to collapse. My voice in those reports is measured. No metaphors, just facts. When you write for insurers and councils, you learn to keep adjectives lean. Tonight the adjectives wanted to swell. A man in an apron opened the inn's door for me without invitation. He looked older than his hands. He had the economy of someone who performed the same motions for years until each movement became part of the room. He set a brass key on the counter between us, oblate and warm, as if it had been sitting in a bowl of hot metal. "You'll want the room with a basin," he said. No preface, no pricing, no question about my business. Just that sentence, precise as a label. When I asked why, he tipped his head and smiled in a way that made the skin at his temples move like parchment. The inn smelled of hemp and copper, 2 scents that became the anchors of the night. Copper in the way a wound smells, not fresh but clean, tanging the air with a metallic memory. Hemp like drying ropes or sacks, human labor bundled and hung. The common room was tidy in a way that mattered. Dishes stacked in order of size, a row of spoons lined like little crescents. On a shelf behind the counter, a shallow basin sat on a wooden slab. It was not full with water so much as with reflection, a surface that held light and deepened it, making the ceiling look farther away than it should. I leaned over, and the basin gave me a face that was mine and not quite. Scent of copper under my nose, the hush of breath that belonged to a house rather than the outdoors. "No signal," the innkeeper said when I asked after my tablet. He didn't say it as a complaint. He said it as if filling out an inventory. I noted it in my mind under constraints. Limited communication, no immediate extraction back to base if the parcel proved hazardous. The town slid into the background of my checklist, a place with no phone lines and human occupants who might not take kindly to strangers. They did not so much as glance when I walked the lane. Eyes momentarily fixed, then the choreography resumed. A woman washing a board at the trough moved the same way, her elbow flicking with the same tiny hesitation, each stroke measured. The child carrying the basin balanced it with both hands and did not look toward me. Their behaviors had the neatness of repetition, practiced, polished, habitual to the point of being ritual. These were not the scattered habits of people left to their own devices. These were iterations of the same small acts, performed in a loop. I put that notation in my book. Repetitive tasks, synchronized movements. I tried to map it as one would map irrigation lines. Where does the water come from? Who is doing the washing? Where are the children sent at dusk? Every answer returned to the inn and the central trough, as if the town's circulatory system passed through that one basin. "Why are there no modern traces?" I asked the innkeeper when we sat for a cup of something that tasted faintly of root and ash. He wiped his hands on his apron, folded them in the way of someone covering a bowl at the end of a meal. "We prefer certain things forgotten," he said. He did not laugh. His head moved a fraction, and the skin under his thumb revealed a small, pale impression like a healed brand. I noticed, but did not press. I left instructions with my tablet and my GPS active to circle the perimeter later. Instead, I walked the main lane at a measured pace, the sort of movement you make when you are counting the length of a room. On the edge of the settlement, a carved sign leaned against a post, its paint long gone and the letters scoured smooth by weather and hands. Someone had etched a new phrase into the wood, a line I would come to know intimately. For those returning. The words made a neat, blunt promise, and because promises in wood are hard to break, I photographed it and moved on. When I decided to leave to test the vacant hypothesis by circumnavigating the site and marking ingress and egress points, the lane guided me easily at first. Gravel, then a small rise, and the same bell tower that should have marked the town center, its shadow long and thin, fell in an entirely different place. I found myself, 15 minutes later, with the signboard again in my view. The carved letters had the same depth, the same weathering. The post I had passed earlier bore a notch I was certain had not been there. Maybe I'd missed it. Maybe I had folded the world around myself like a map and failed to flatten it out. I walked out a second time, slower this round, deliberate, with the measuring wheel keeping a steady thump on the earth. I timed my steps, logged them in my pad, 147 paces from the inn to the juncture by the sycamore, 23 paces to the carved sign. When I came upon the sign again, there were 147 paces between me and the inn. I stood with my wheel idling, a little dog in the lane watching from a stoop. The same dog that had nodded its head as I walked past earlier. It blinked in a pattern I could now recognize. 3 beats, 1 long. It looked at me as if counting, then turned back to its porch. I began to press the town. It was my job to stress test these places, to find weak points, to determine whether they posed hazards. I struck doors with the flat of my hand, tested locks, prodded latch plates. Doors were wooden, tight, unyielding in a way that suggested they had been maintained. Windows opened only to peer back at a shelf of jars or a neatly folded blanket. Once I saw a child's toy placed in the exact center of a hearth, its painted face blurred and worn, as if the owner had returned it deliberately to that position each evening. I asked a woman sweeping at the foot of a stoop, "Is there a council? Do you have someone in charge?" And her answer was a motion of the wrist, a tiny circle with the broom, and then she smiled the way the man in the apron had smiled. At dusk, the light shifted the textures cleanly. Shadows pooled like cloth in the alleys. The bass of some distant, regular sound threaded beneath the town like the subwoofer in a concert hall. It was not music, exactly, but a vibration through the soles of your feet. A low-frequency insistence that suggested machinery or a very large throat. When I put my ear to the inn's basin that evening, the surface pulsed with that same frequency. The reflection did not ripple like water. It throbbed gently, swell and retreat, as if the basin were breasts inhaling and exhaling light. "If you like slow burn mysteries," I heard myself say to the camera I habitually left running, "hit subscribe." It felt absurd to mention it in the darkening square, but the words planted a small human anchor into the evening. A line between the recording I made for the files and the one I'd later edit for an audience that fed on the slow creep of dread. I kept the CTA short and mechanical and then returned the camera to its case. It is a habit of people who narrate. We hedge our fear with formats. My first night was spent in the room with the basin. The innkeeper had insisted. The brass key settled into my palm like an accusation. The room was small and efficient. A narrow bed, a chest, and the basin beneath the narrow window. It sat on a stand carved with a shallow spiral. The basin was not a receptacle for washing so much as a platform for light. When I leaned close to inspect it, I saw, reflected under the ceiling's dim glow, more than a ceiling. There was a depth to the surface that suggested layers. The top plane mirrored my face, but below, as if through a translucent skin, something moved. The movement was not reflection, but presence. When I pressed my fingertip against the rim, the metal of the brass key hummed under my palm, and for a moment a taste of cold iron filled my mouth. I woke once that night to a sound like many spoons gently placed on wood. The basin in my room made a fine ringing, the tone of it almost laughable as you think of laughter at midnight. I opened my hand and found that my palm bore the faint trace of a line I'd not noticed before. A tiny abrasion as if someone had brushed the skin with the edge of a coin. It was the sort of injury you get when you fumble with keys. I made a note in my journal, abrasion right palm, no further action. When I left the inn the next morning, prepared for another circuit, I moved with a clinician's irritation at an incongruence. The signpost was where it always was. Yet the sycamore beside the lane bore a new carved line below the "for those returning" that read, "For those taken." The letters were sharper here, carved recently, their edges still frayed with wood dust. The addition was small and subtle, but it shifted the grammar of the whole place. If returning was promised, being taken implied a transaction. I had not yet been taken then. But as the day eroded toward afternoon, the town pursued its chores with a singular steadiness that seemed designed to distract. A procession of women carried basins in careful balance along a side street, filling them at a communal trough. The water they drew shimmered with flecks of something that caught light like mica. Their hands were steady. Their eyes, when they passed within range of mine, reflected the world in a way that suggested observation rather than recognition, as if my presence were a specimen under glass. On the third pass around the perimeter, I found a split in the lane I had not noticed before, a narrow stair leading between two foundations down into the earth. It was well hidden, a hatch concealed beneath a threshold stone. Someone had swept it clean. The groove around the lid bore the faintest residue of a dark resin. I pried at it with a crowbar from my kit, and a smell rose up that was at once ancient and intimate. Warm resin, wet earth, and that metallic tang again. When the hatch yielded, I put a flashlight down the shaft. It revealed a ladder, and beyond that, a shallow tunnel rimed with a material that looked almost like cartilage, a pale, waxy surface streaked with the color of varnish and old blood. The ladder groaned in a manner that made me note the sound in my book as structural creak. Consider weight. My training says you photograph everything before you touch it. My training also says never go into subterranean shafts alone without a tether. I ignored one of those rules for curiosity's sake, and because something in the pull of that hole felt like an invitation I could not map in my field notes. I lowered myself, boot by boot, the ladder complaining under the shift of weight. It smelled of resin and copper and breath. From below came a low, regular tapping. Not a human tapping, nor a stone on stone. More like the measured stroke of a pendulum through the viscera of a house. Halfway down, the ladder jerks. I look up, and the opening is framed by hands. They are not a pair, but a cluster. Fingers calloused and small, a child's hand curling against an older one. The hands let go and slide into the dark as if a routine had been interrupted. Below, the tunnel is narrow but not unwalkable. It slopes slightly downward, and the walls are not stone but something that gives under pressure with the compliant texture of cartilage. My flashlight beam melts into the shine of its surface. As I pass, the skin of the corridor seems to breathe, contracting and smoothing like a lung. I note tactile details as a reflex. The walls feel warm and oily under my palm. They have the fine grain of an animal hide varnished with resin. A thin film of moisture beads at the intersections where the curve of the wall meets the floor. When I touch it, the beads do not wet my fingers much. They bead away like mercury. The light picks up veins, tiny ridges beneath the translucent skin that look suspiciously like laminated roots. There is pressure here. A sense that the place is held together not by mortar but by suction. The tunnel opens into a low-sided chamber before I can get enough of a read. The chamber smells of steeped leaves and rusted metal. There are supports in the form of arches that run like ribs overhead, reaching down into the blanket of shadow and returning as if the entire space were a mouth. Against one wall, half submerged in a shallow inlet carved from the rock, rests a basin. Smaller than the one in my room but of the same strange composition, it floats a finger's breadth above the ground and holds a viscous surface that refuses to be obeyed by light. The surface refuses to be flat. It clings to a geometry all its own, lifting in domes and then flattening as if a heartbeat traveled through it. Around the basin are arrangements I almost read as furniture. Low stools, bundles of rope, a ring of small jars. Each jar had a lid of pale wax, and inside, suspended in some amber fluid, were objects that made my mouth go dry to look at. Thin fragments that might have been clipped from clothing, embroidery thread, a child's shoe buckle, the lace tip of a bobbin. The perimeter of the chamber was lined with alcoves, small niches cut into the wall, each holding names whittled into wood plates. I could make out several names, common ones, then a clustered line of letters that looked like a script someone had half remembered. I photographed them. The camera's flash picked up the sheen of something on the plaques, a glaze that made the names almost float. As I advanced, a draft rose from the basin like a breath. It carried the scent of copper again, but richer this time, threaded with a sweetness that made the corners of my mouth water. I set my field kit down at the chamber's edge and ran a gloved finger along one of the plaques. The instrument I used, no more than a cheap penlight, caught on a shallow spiral carved into the wood. The spiral was a line that looped, and along it were little notches, each notch labeled with a name. The spiral's center was blank, a waiting place. For reasons that had less to do with professionalism than with a sudden deep human dread, I wrote down the word that pushed into my mind. Tally. When I pressed the pen to paper, the skin on my forearm prickled. It was a little thing first, a subtle heat, as though someone had breathed against the inside of my sleeve. My hand stilled, and when I lifted my sleeve to check there, under the crook of my elbow, lay a faint gray mark. It was not a scab or a bruise. It was a thin sigil, no bigger than a coin, etched into the skin as if by a finger dipped in ash. The mark was not raised, but it hummed. I have seen many marks in my life. Bruises, tending scars, brandings in far places where old practices linger. This was different. It was precise and seemed to make sense on an organ level. It fit around the shape of my muscle like a ring. I do not know when it had appeared. One moment my arm was clean, the next, when I had been watching the notches on the spiral and thinking of tallying, there it was. I photographed the mark and logged it as unexplained dermal pattern, non-hemorrhagic, clinically neat even in the face of strangeness. I told myself that was what I was doing, cataloging anomalies for later analysis. But the mark warmed under my fingers in a way that was neither angry nor pleasant. It made a noise in my teeth that felt like someone counting under their breath. I backed away from the plaque to give myself distance and rolled my shoulders as if to convince myself it was a pinprick reaction. The basin in the middle of the chamber made a soft, continuous noise, not a chant but a susurration made of many mouths. Distantly through the cartilage walls I could hear movement, rhythmic scraping, the sound of cloth sliding on wood, a near instant of childish laughter that ended in a small sob. As if someone practiced both emotions until they fit. I decided on a plan I would later call foolish, but which at the time felt mandatory. I would take samples, document the chamber, and leave. I set up a small tripod and aimed my camera at the basin. The surface of the liquid refused to obey the camera's sensor. Each exposure returned a mismatch. Where my eye saw surface, the camera returned something deeper. Where the camera recorded a hollow of light, my eye insisted there was a small reflected face. The first few frames contained nothing but strange refractions. On the sixth exposure, a smear resolved into a face that was not mine and not quite anyone else's. It sat where a reflection should be. The mouth closed and the eyes wet with the sheen that every other eye in the town had. I brought my face close to the basin and inhaled. The scent filled me. Iron, sugar, a perfume that might be described as rose steeped in vinegar. When I exhaled, my breath fogged the surface, and for an instant in the clouded film I saw a script. Letters crossing the air in a rhythm that could have been a language. My brain, which prefers order over mystery, treated the moment as a hallucination. I had eaten nothing unusual. I had no fever. Nonetheless, I felt as if someone under the floor had read my name. There was no one in the chamber except me and the basin and the press of the walls. And yet the basin shifted as if acknowledging me. The dome at its center rose a fraction, then smoothed, and when it settled, there was a ripple that carried tiny motes upward like a breath. The mote-laden air tasted like copper. I put my hand into the basin to test its viscosity, and the world, briefly and without consent, tilted. My gloved fingers met resistance that was not complete, an elastic pull as though the medium preferred to hold my skin and let go at will. The glove left a film on the surface, a faint, smiling smear that caught the light. I could have left then, filed the footage, left the hole sealed, and the world resumed to ordinary acreage. Instead, heat flashed along my arm, and the sigil at my elbow throbbed. Through the soft hum of the chamber I heard, clear and near, a voice that was not a voice made of words but of intent. I will not attempt to transcribe it. To name the sound is already to commit it to an accuracy I do not possess. It was more like a movement in the ribs of the room, a single contained demand. In a sentence that has haunted me since, the air felt like it was saying, "Bring me back. We are trained to resist anthropomorphizing things. You teach yourself to call patterns what they are, repeated motions, systemized behaviors, artifacts of habit. Yet habit in that town was anything but inert. It acted. The chores, the basins, the spiral. They functioned with a purpose that ate at distinctions between object and sacrament. They were instruments with patient mouths. At the chamber's lip, the light of the lamp made one of the jars relevant for argument. Inside the wax-sealed vessel was a thread of hair looped through a tiny knot of linen. It spun slowly in the amber fluid like a clock hand. There were dozens of such jars. Each held fragments, a button, a child's ribbon, a sliver of a comb. Small personal things suspended in amber that preserved not memories but potential. I imagined their owners, washed faces, knot-tight fingers, the exact angle of a hand at dusk. The chamber seemed to catalog these minutiae as if it read from a ledger of selves. The parchment on the inn's counter had called this a flagged parcel. My file number was simple, nothing dramatic. Yet now my notes scribbled in the margins were theological in their tone. Tally, offering, notches. I took a breath and leveled myself with the job. Evidence, photographs, containment. The practical voice entered again. Record, observe, leave. These are the commands of the professional as much as the man with the pen is a priest in his own right. I gathered my samples with gloved hands, corking jars of the amber fluid and bagging the jars with the small objects. Each seal I closed felt like a negotiation. The resin smelled stronger when contained, a perfume of mended bones. As I fitted the final sample into my pack, the soft scraping in the corridor picked up tempo and became palsied with the rhythm of feet moving to and from a chore. Above me, muffled as if through a blanket, voices braided, women's undertone, children's thin chorus. A sound like chanting coaxed the space into a single pulse. I could have stayed on the surface and tried to understand the town from the vantage of porches and troughs. I could have written the language of my findings as pages of temperature and humidity, or as photos in a binder. Instead, the place had, a few hours after my first pass, found a way to mark me. The insignia at my elbow had not faded. It had grown a milky center, like a recorded bloom. I pressed my thumb to it and felt a small corrugation under the skin, the way a scar feels when you run over it with a tongue. When I made my decision to go deeper, it was not because I had become brave. It was because the town, in the way a living creature will fix a gaze on the thing that observes it, had made me part of its curiosity. There is a kind of compulsion you see in fieldwork. The sample that resists is the one you chase. The tunnel had resisted my earlier attempts to map. The spiral had a blank center that wanted filling. Something in the architecture hinted at a hunger, and it had named me an ingredient. Before I descended, I took off my glove and used the tip of a sterile swab to sample the rim of the basin. The swab came away under the lamp smeared with a thin, dark film that reflected light like oil. I sealed it in a bag and noted everything. The camera was running. I clicked a brief statement into view. Sample collected. Viscous organic film. No immediate signs of pathogens. Field analysis pending. I speak in small, predictable forms to keep my voice from tipping into story. In the tunnel's mouth, a sound rose up. A child's voice counting in a cadence that looped like the vein of a heartbeat. The syllables were normal, numbers perhaps, but the inflection rose and fell in a way that suggested chant. The corridor was warmer now. The air moved in a small current that helped my breath settle into time with the rhythm of some internal clockwork. My headlamp washed over a wall that, in the half-light, showed a series of incisions. The incisions were not merely decorative. They were shallow grooves, filled with a resinous scab that glinted like lacquer. Along their length were tiny notches, the same mark I had traced on the spiral. I strained to read them. Each notch corresponded to a name. Someone, something, had been cataloging returns for a long time. I placed my palm on the cool wall, because professionals sometimes touch things to convince their senses. The surface gave a little to my hand, not weakness but compliance, like a mat that acknowledged the pressure and then adopted its shape. A tiny vibration passed through my bones and the sigil at my elbow throbbed in answer. I felt, in that instant, the curious and claustrophobic certainty that the stairway was not a speaking in isolation, but part of an entire vocabulary. The town was writing with its architecture. The first half of the tunnel runs like an artery. After that it branches. On one passage, a voice hummed that was almost music, a small cluster singing into the walls and the walls carrying it back. On another, I could hear the whisper of fabric on stone. Hands smoothing, folding, repeating. A smell that I could only describe as warm linen and iron threaded each corridor. My stomach tightened. The professional in me recorded everything. Distances, angles, materials. The human in me felt watched. At one intersection I found a low carved niche where someone had placed a child's shoe. Its leather cracked and polished. Beside it lay a strip of carved bone with letters burned into it. I could not read them all. The light refracted oddly as if the letters sat at the edge of comprehension. When I touched the bone strip, the area of the sigil under my sleeve seared cold, then hot, with the odd sensation of being acknowledged. The chamber seemed to shiver. Somewhere down the corridor a basin chimed like a glass. I had reached a point where retreat was possible. The town allowed exits. It was not that kind of trap. But when I turned to climb back the ladder to the surface, the tunnel breathed in a way that altered the air to my lungs. The ascent took longer than it had the night before. The hatch's stone felt thicker, the sky above smaller. When I finally surfaced, I was not where I thought I had left the lane. The sycamore was farther down the hill. The carved sign had shifted a notch higher on its post. For those returning had a fresh chip on the letter R, as if someone had sharpened it. When I walked back to the inn, the innkeeper was at the door as if waiting. He held my brass key between two fingers and regarded it with a softness I didn't like. "You found the stair," he said. He placed a cup of warm something into my hands without ceremony. He watched me sip as if timing the swallow. "They like to keep the ledger tidy," he added. And then he looked past me toward the lane where a child was balancing a basin with a concentration that set its jaw tight. The child's eyes flicked toward me and then away, eyes as reflective as the basin's surface. "Who are they?" I asked. "I mean the people of the town. Who keeps them? Who keeps the ledger?" He shrugged. "They keep themselves," he said. He spoke as the man who trims a hedge and does not ask the plant why it grows the way it does. His hands flexed around the cup. The pale mark at his wrist showed again, a small sigil almost identical to the one at my elbow. He noticed my stare and then, as if deciding such things were better said plain, he said, "Be careful how you tally." The warning was not a prayer. It was an inventory item placed beside my name. I left a voice memo on my tablet that night to log anomaly, dermal marking present, sudden onset. I used the sterile language because it keeps the body calm. Under the implacable fluorescence of the inn's room, I laid my hand where the sigil slept and felt the curt vibration of it. The notation in my book measured that it had increased by 0.3 millimeters in diameter in the last 12 hours. Whether that meant growth or tightening, I could not say. At some point in the night, sleep took me in fits. Dreams were small edits of the day. A child balancing a basin with a face that blurred into an off-white smear. The innkeeper's hand opening the door and dropping a shoe into the basin. My own name wrapped in the spiral's notches and reversed like a stamp. Waking, I was bothered less by a fog of fear than by an ineffable calculation. The town wanted continuity. It wanted accounts kept. When morning fell, I attempted to break the pattern. I gathered my kit, affixed the GPS tracker to my belt, and walked the lane faster than before. I wanted to test one simple professional hypothesis, that the town's apparent loop could be explained by an odd network of roads or by an optical trick caused by the shape of the valley. I strode past the sycamore, counting steps, eyes to my wheel. The carved sign came into view. The letters were the same. The post, however, bore a fresh notch at the top, as if someone had taken a knife to mark the hours. The dog on the stoop barked 3 times, then fell silent. And when I turned the corner toward the road, I realized the ground under my feet had changed. The dirt path I had walked down with confident linear steps had rearranged. Weeds where there had been none. A small stone moved to the center of the track like a punctuation mark. The world had become obsessive about its pattern. The tunnel had a language. The spiral was a calendar, and the basin was a counting machine. All day I tried to reduce the town to intact measurements. Each attempt returned me to the same tidy center. At every step, the town corrected me. It was in the late afternoon, while cataloging the trough in the main square, that I noticed movement at the edges of my field of vision that made my skin crawl. Children were not only performing routine, they were engaged in a ritual of repetition that involved small self-inflicted acts. Plucking a thread from the hem of a shirt and conjoining it to another, gently cutting a sliver from a wooden toy and placing it afloat in the basin. None of the acts were violent. None were charming. They had the mechanical logic of practice. The same small hand motion repeated until a shape was reached. A boy stepped toward the basin, bent, and placed a palm into the water. The water accepted it and rose to meet his hand, cold or warm I could not be sure. When he withdrew his hand, a smear clung to him like a blessing. He looked up at me for a fraction of a second, eyes meeting mine with the sharpness of someone who recognizes a ledger keeper. I understood then why the townspeople did not see me the way visitors are seen. They were not blind to my presence. Rather, their attention had been divided and allocated in such a way that I existed only in one register of their perception. As an anomaly, as something to be accounted for and then passed along. They counted me in a pause between chores and then moved to the next item on their list. That evening, while I sat in the inn attempting to parse what limited footage I had taken, the innkeeper laid a shallow bowl at my elbow. It was of simple clay and contained a dark, viscous fluid. "For memory," he said. His voice had no malice, but it had weight. To remember the shape of things, I lifted the bowl. The fluid felt warm through the clay. I set it down and shook my head. I was too trained to be tempted by hospitality that asked for everything in return. I told him, "I have food. I have water. I have what I need." He shrugged and poured a few drops of the fluid into a basin on the counter. The drops rose from the surface and flew, single motes like the dust in sunlight, towards an old tin that sat on a high shelf. They sank into the tin, and when the lid was removed, a faint sound emerged. For a moment the whole inn inhaled, and what came out was a line of cadence. Small, childlike numbers counted out correctly, then out of sequence, then corrected. The innkeeper pinched the edge of his apron and his hand trembled. "You mustn't take more than you can give," he said. "They like balance." I left the inn that night with a jar of amber fluid in my pack, and a weight that was not purely professional hung behind my sternum. The signpost at the road's edge had acquired another notch. For those returning looked less like a promise now, and more like a ledger's header. I did not sleep much that night. Between restless dozes, I rehearsed the professional checklist like a talisman. Evidence, containment, chain of custody. The sigil under my sleeve pulsed like a small animal caught in a trap, and the amber jar sat heavy in my pack. The inn's thin lamps threw maps of shadow across the ceiling, and I kept imagining the spiral's blank center as a mouth waiting for an answer. Morning came slow, and with it a decision that felt less like courage than a requirement. There was a center to the town's machinery. I had seen the basin rooms, the ledger plaques, the jars of things suspended, and if I could interrupt that center, maybe the process would miscount and return to error. Maybe the loop would unfasten like a sewn seam, or maybe I would be added to the tally. Both possibilities arranged themselves on my tongue. One tasted metallic, and the other tasted like old paper. I chose the route that let me keep my professional record. Intervene and document. I left the inn with the pack tightly fastened, and the brass key heavy in my pocket. The lane moved under my boots in a measured way, as if the path itself followed rules. Children watched me from stoops, and when their eyes met mine, the look contained equal parts observation and indifference. Like a camera registering a frame it would file and forget in the next beat. A woman by a doorway paused while smoothing the hem of a cloth and added a loose thread to a bundle she held. A motion so small it could have been a twitch. Still, everything in that motion felt like participation. The stair hidden beneath the threshold stone waited for me, the lid sealed and rubbed nearly clean by passing hands. I paused and laid my palm on the wood. The sigil under my skin answered with a fine, cold shock. The town noticed me like a living thing notices the wind. I pulled the hatch, slid down the ladder, and into the cartilage sheen tunnel. It smelled of resin and old soap and something like the inside of a mouth after a long night's talk. The tunnel opened into a larger gallery I had not explored. A sort of nave carved horizontally through the earth, its ceiling arched like a sternum. Lamps hung from ribs, and inside each lamp a small bowl of the same viscous, reflective fluid glowed faintly, pulsing in time with a distant sound I now understood as the town's heartbeat. Beside each lamp were stools and little niches where more nameplates rested. The plates were numerous here, packed close like shingles. Their notches formed a sequence. My camera could not quite focus on them because the beam seemed to diffuse as if the air itself were thickened with a sort of varnish. At the far end of the nave there was a raised dais. On it stood a pedestal ringed by several basins, larger than the ones in the private chambers, each hovering a few inches above carved platforms. Between the basins rose a framework of ribs and struts, architecture and anatomy braided together. It looked disturbingly like a ribcage being constructed around a skeleton that had not decided what it was. Threads of resin spanned the inner spaces like ligaments, connecting basin to basin. From the pedestal a thin column of light rose. Not light as you know it, but an upthrust of pale material that pulled glints of dust into a slow spiral. The column twisted as if wind had been poured into a tube. People were arranged around the dais like attendants around an altar. Their motions were careful and automatic, filling cups, tilting small vessels, pronouncing short, wordless cadences that resembled instruction more than prayer. The innkeeper stood near the pedestal like a steward, his hands steady. He met my gaze with an expression I did not want to be in his debt to. There was something in it that read as apology and accuracy simultaneously. I had thought my presence would be acknowledged. The town acknowledged me by increasing the tempo of its ritual motions, as if the machine required more input to maintain equilibrium when a new variable entered the field. A child approached carrying a basin, the liquid within catching the lamp's strange glow. The child's face was impassive, features arranged with the smallness of practice. The child's hands trembled, but only the tiniest amount, the same micro-tremor I had seen in the innkeeper when he poured his warm drops. The basin lifted closer to the pedestal. When the child poured, the action was slow and ceremonial. The liquid did not spill in the way water does. Instead, it uncoiled from the rim as if it were a sheet being rolled up, and it slid into the receiving basin where it joined a shallow pool. Where the joining occurred, the surface pulled together like a membrane and rose into a small dome. I watched the dome accumulate, swelling with a placid hunger. Each offering gave up something. A luster, a color shift, a thread of light that withdrew into the forming column. The jars on the dais, some that had once held toys and locks and hair, seemed to liquefy in memory and feed the central thing. As I watched, the spiral of names somewhere in the nave began to register in my peripheral vision with an urgency I could not ignore. A notch on the outer ring was fresh. A small hand had notched it within the last hours. My name had appeared higher up the spiral than I remembered, but near the center there was a small blank that hummed with insistence. The column that rose from the pedestal rose a little higher, and within its pale material I glimpsed structures that suggested form. A suggestion of a jaw, an impression like a rib. The thing was being braided into being not by some mind, but by a logistics of offerings, pieces of self, folded into vessels, poured, condensed. The sigil at my elbow burned like a watchful brand. I felt, with a clarity that made me nauseous, that the town was counting me even as I counted it. Names were not just names, they were transactions. Each notch, each jar, each smear of amber represented an account closed. My presence was a new line being penciled into a book. I did not want to be part of its accounting. There is a peculiar sort of bargaining that happens when you are faced with an apparatus you cannot flatten into policy. You think of options in enumerated form: flee, expose, sabotage, bargain. Escape felt increasingly unlikely. The town's cartography was elastic and would fold to coax me back. Exposure would risk either disbelief or bureaucratic smothering. Sabotage was the only method that kept my hands and my conscience aligned. I resolved to intervene at the point of formation, the pedestal. My steps were careful as I moved between the attendants. Some looked up as I passed, most did not. One woman set down a bowl and straightened, and for a moment I noticed the area beneath her sleeve. Another sigil, pale and circular. When I stepped close enough to the pedestal, heat rose in a wave against my chest, an invisible pressure pressing outward from the central column, as if it were testing the space for leaks. The basin nearest me rose, and a thin film of that viscous surface slid upward when I breathed on it. When the surface parted, the column took in an extra thread and sighed. At that instant, the spiral's center spoke. Not in words, but by completing itself. The blank in the wood filled with handwriting that was not carved but grown. Letters of my name surfaced along the spiral in ink that looked like dried syrup. I did not mistake it. The sight of my name rising out of the carved wood was more intimate and more terrifying than any oath. It felt like a certification. My skin prickled, my breath hitched. I have been trained to keep evidence from contaminating judgment, but training dissolves quickly when survival is in the balance. The professionalism in me, the part that writes clean reports and loops files into a chain, blunted like iron in acid. I acted. I grabbed the basin nearest me. The action was lightning fast, not rehearsed but reflexive. Heft, swing, impact. The basin struck the rim of the pedestal with a force that sent light and viscous droplets into the air. Sound broke like struck glass, only lower, deeper, as if the whole place vibrated in a register meant for organs. For a second nothing moved, and then the central column shuddered. The reaction was immediate and not the simple collapse I had anticipated. The pedestal did not simply cease, it convulsed. Fluid threads snapped like capillaries. The rising dome at the center of a receiving basin broke apart and retracted as if inhaling. The resin ligaments that bridged the structure shuddered and shed flaking skin. The attendants faltered. Their movements, so perfect a moment ago, became staggered, like a watch that loses its hairspring. The town's hum stuttered and then multiplied into 1,000 tiny frequencies that jarred my teeth. Something reached for me. It was not hands but pressure, a honeyed force that tried to take hold of my arms and throat with the gentleness of a child's embrace. It sought not flesh but memory. I felt my own recollections like beads being threaded out of me. Small points of taste and smell. Faces. The exact shape of a lover's laugh. The sensation was not violent in description but was shattering in effect. A hollowing from within, as if someone had begun to peel layers of me and set them in jars. It was intimate and obscene at once. I pulled back. The sigil under my sleeve pulsed, frantic, as if trying to wrestle my arm back into the counting. I smashed the basin a second time. The sound was a raw crack that split the hum into shards. The pedestal reeled and a seam opened at its base. For an instant the architecture showed its mechanics. Veins of dark resin, thin sheaths of woven fiber, an inner drum that had been spinning and pulling since before I had walked into the lane. The chamber roared then, not with voices but with unsteady, dissonant tones like a throat being scraped. Jars vibrated on their shelves and many cracked. The jars' contents, the little fragments of lives suspended in amber, slithered free as if now unmoored. Some drifted into the air like pollen, others dissolved into motes that washed the attendants' feet with glittering residue. People began to weep openly, their carefully kept composure unraveling. The child who had first poured his basin sank to his knees and clutched at the air where, moments before, the column had held a suggestion of form. The entity, if that is the word, was making a final feverish attempt to assemble itself. Threads of offering braided into a bulbous shape that hung just above the pedestal, pulsing with a sickly, organ-like rhythm. It had the suggestion of a head and the faint architecture of a mouth that had not yet learned how to speak. Its surface caught light oddly, neither wet nor dry, and there were veins like translucent cords running along its skin. From within, it came a low, eldering tone that suggested completion and precedent both. I recognized, with a clarity that felt like a verdict, what it intended: to condense accounts into a nascent presence, to fold names into an emergent will. The spiral center, the blank that had wanted filling, served as both registry and womb. The town's calculations had reached the point of extraction. If that column had pulled at me for memory, then full assembly would have insisted on identity. It would have finished the cipher. I did the only thing that did not feel like surrender. I swung the remainder of the basin, what shards were left, and struck the pedestal at a new angle, shattering supports and upsetting the geometry. The impact fractured the ligaments, and the central column spasmed. For a heartbeat the nascent form stuttered, then recoiled in on itself like a breath drawn backward. The retreat was not graceful. The construct did not melt into nothing. Instead, it convulsed, expelled something like steam that smelled like hot iron and sugar, and an array of motes erupted outward. The motes found faces first: attendants, children, the innkeeper. They settled upon skin and clothing, and for a moment each person froze as if trying on a new fit. Some dissolved into the air, others leaked from pores in a slow, tear-like fashion. The town lurched, the archways buckled and flexed, and the walls' cartilage plies separated with a noise like 1,000 fingernails peeling loose. Then the worst thing happened. The town began to close. Like a lung that had been held open, the architecture attempted to snap shut on the breach. Corridors compressed, ceiling ribs bowed inward. Footsteps became treacherous as the floor shifted underfoot. I felt a pressure on my sternum like someone squeezing a chest, and the sigil at my elbow burned white-hot. I thought my skin would split. My ears filled with a single high-pitched whine that seemed to search for a frequency of admission. Panic sharpened my perception. The catalogue of my training, the tethered entry, the buddy system, appeared like a ghost of reassurance, and I cursed myself for not obeying it. The innkeeper's face was in front of me, his mouth open in a soundless word, eyes that did not plead but recorded. I grabbed for him to pull him toward the ladder and the gallery and to the surface beyond. He moved like someone woke in mid-prayer, and his hands were slick with something like sweat and lacquer. I must have been more brutal than I have ever been to him, because when he stumbled he did not glare or accuse. He only made a small, incredulous sound, as if surprised he could still make noise. The tunnel threw me up toward the hatch. Resin flaked like dried paint clinging to my sleeves. The ladder felt slippery as if woven with the liquid the basins had used. I climbed with hands that had forgotten gentleness and reached the surface with lungs that did not know how to pull in air. The night was wrong. No, not the night. The world outside fared as if trying to correct itself. The sycamore stood where trees stand. The signpost bore new notches, but the letters had begun to blur as if being erased. For those returning had been scratched at until it was nearly illegible. The dog on the stoop whimpered and then ran off, its body losing resolution like a smear of paint. I remember running, not thinking of cameras or evidence but of the thin, human part of me that just wanted away. The path folded and buckled and became other dirt underfoot. At the ridge I saw, for the first time in days, something not catalogued by the town, a patch of bracken, untrimmed and wild, where nettles burgeoned free. The settlement in the hollow below convulsed as a unit and then gasped. When the gasp released, the valley sank. I saw, absurdly, the archways and basins collapse inward, like the bellows of an organ being smashed. The nascent form on the pedestal imploded into a cloud of motes that were thicker and quicker than before, like an exhalation of old breath. The motes rose, met the low cloud that had always hung above the town like residue, and vanished, as if being absorbed by a sky with teeth. The ribs that had lined corridors sagged and reknit themselves into something more like earth, no longer architectural but geologic. The lanes filled with falling silt, and the signpost cracked and slumped into the dirt. I should tell you the exact sensation when the world seemed to snap back. It was like someone smoothing a crumpled sheet abruptly. The edges caught, dust flew, and an odd, clean silence followed. The hum ceased, as if a machine had been unplugged. For a wild, blessed moment, there was only the wind and the small, unmechanized sounds of an uninhabited landscape. A bird's thin cry, the snap of twig underfoot, the distant moving of leaves. I staggered. The innkeeper lay on the inn's porch with his chest rising in shallow, swift pulls. Children, some young, some older, were on the ground curling in on themselves, blinking away tears like sleep. A few of them did not breathe at all. Did not breathe as we mean breathing. Their chests were as still as wood. I could only see faces and hands. Familiar-seeming features gone soft, as if someone had gone over them with a damp cloth. Some people lay at the bases of hearths with their fingers still curled around fragments of toys. A smell of singed resin and copper filled the air. I moved among them, touching shoulders and calling names because professional training insists on procedure, and because I could not reconcile my hands with the sight. One child blinked at me slowly and then opened his mouth to make a noise that was neither word nor cry. It was a drawn-out vowel that might have been a name. When he reached for me, his fingers traced the air as if pulling on threads. His palm left a greasy print on my sleeve. Then his eyes cleared and he stood as if woken from sleeping, and simply walked away down the lane, dirt in his hair, and did not look back. Another, an older woman, wept and laughed in the same breath, clutching her apron as if afraid of losing the thing it held. There were bodies that carried no sign of life. I will not elaborate on them because the law and an ethics I carry insist on restraint in description. Know this. Some who had been participants fell into a deep, inert sleep. Others remained, in a manner of speaking, present, eyes open, faces partially rearranged, like dolls waiting to be put back on shelves. I could not tell at the time whether those who did not move were dead or simply withdrawn into a new state that our vocabulary lacked. The town had been either broken or opened, I could not tell which. I did not stay to count. The sound of sirens, cars, not ambulances, because I had called for no emergency and had only my own breath and a trembling thumb on a satellite ping, was not present. I gathered what I could, not wanting to inhale evidence that would later be twisted into sensationalism. The amber jar was intact. My camera, smashed by the basin earlier, had one surviving card which in some frames had recorded nothing but a smear and in others contained images that later haunted me. The spiral with its notches, the child's hand, a flash of my own face in the basin as if mirrored by a different person. I left the valley under a sky bleaching to a thin blue that had none of the town's hum in it. The fields on the far side began to look like nothing had ever been there. The lane behind me reduced itself into a bed of ferns and earth. The signpost rotted into a shallow pit of splinters. The carved exhortation, for those returning, had been scratched out by whatever calculus had run amok. Where the inn had stood there were only footprints and a depression, as if someone had removed furnishings and left a dent. I drove away with hands that shook so badly I could barely set the tablet mount. On the drive back to the county road, I did something that would have cost me a reprimand in any proper survey. I recorded a muttered, unedited account on my device. I told it what had happened in the starkest terms I could manage without either fantasy or poetry. My report that night was a net of clinical statements cast over an impossible thing. I wrote, structural collapse, potential organic contamination, unexplained dermal marks noted in site personnel, artifacts recovered for secure analysis. I wrote what would both protect me professionally and be plausible enough to be filed away in an office that would prefer to box these anomalies and place them on a shelf. There are shapes to cover-ups. You file an incident report, you log evidence, You send in a request for analysis. I filled the forms with the oil-slick movements of a man who knows how to balance truth against the inertia of bureaucracy. I sent an initial notice to my employer. Parcel secured, no immediate public hazard. Recommend full site remediation with hazmat and cultural liaison. I used the language everyone uses to keep nightmares from becoming headlines. Privately, I did other things. I unfurled the surviving memory card in a lab with no oversight and copied images to a drive I encrypted and hid. I photographed the sigil beneath my elbow again in a sterile light and kept the file separate. The amber jar I sealed and placed in a lockbox at my house. Sometimes late, I would unlock it and hold it to the light and find the thing inside suspended like a fossil. It smelled faintly of copper and rose. I would close the lid and tell myself it was just an odd biological sample. Days bled into a sequence of official visits and questions that felt like riddles. A supervisor came once with an expression between curiosity and caution. He asked routine things. Did I maintain a tether? Was a second party present? And then went quiet when my answers produced gaps. I kept my report tight. I did not mention the spiral by name, nor the way my own letters had risen like mold. I wrote instead of collapses and possible cultic paraphernalia and recommended controlled study. It is a comfort in a way to trust a system of forms. The county's paperwork moved as bureaucracies do, slowly and without appetite for myth. Field technicians came in protective gear and declared certain areas unstable. They photographed and labeled and bagged and catalogued, their faces blank but their hands steady. They did not find the inn on day 2. On day 3 the site was fenced, then it was a notation on a map, and later it was an entry in a database with a classification that smelled of finality. The valley was, on paper, simply decommissioned. No press release was issued. No hole was drilled into the earth to determine what had become of the basins. I could have let it rest there, a blot on my memory and a file in a drawer. But you do not downshift from a place that has pushed its iron teeth into you. The sigil under my skin pulsed from time to time like a small, unwelcome heartbeat. It was not particularly painful. It was disconcerting, as if a pocket inside me had a wire sewn into its seam. At random moments I would catch myself repeating odd acts. Smoothing a table in the same tiny, practiced motions of the town. Setting a spoon down with the exact crescent orientation I had noticed on that shelf. It was, the therapist later told me, a sign of intrusive memory made habit. Habit becomes ritual in cramped spaces. Weeks later, in a private office that smelled like lemon cleaner, I prepared an expanded document for a client who had requested more detail for insurance reasons. The document was sober. I attached photographs of the holes, and of jars, and of the tunnels. I wrote in measured language about organic architectural features, and anomalous anthropogenic structures. I left out, carefully and deliberately, the images of the spiral with my name in it, and the section of footage that showed the column's incomplete form. I redacted certain frames. The world appreciates redaction. It offers plausible deniability. What I did not redact was the last line in my personal notes. The candid sentence scrawled across a page in a handwriting that felt like a confession. The town is not empty. I do not say what it is. I cannot. To ascribe a label would be to make a truth that doesn't belong to any one noun. It is not a god, nor a cult in any organized sense. It is not mechanistic in a way that your engineers might map. It is crafted and emergent both, an apparatus that used community as a feedstock, and then attempted to compose a presence from what it gathered. It made people into material and then hammered that material into form. Whether the maker is the town itself, an organism of tradition birthing an adaptation, or something that learned to use the town's rituals as ligatures, I do not know. I only know the arithmetic of its appetite. Names, fragments, repetitions, offerings pressed into a column. A spiral that logs and expects. I keep the amber jar in a locked small box at home, in a place only I have a key to, and sometimes I take it out at night. Under the lamp it looks both ordinary and menacing, a chunk of viscous sleeping time. Once, during a late inspection, I opened the lid and a faint scent rose that made my eyes water. Copper and sugar and something floral. I smelled it and then set the jar back. The smell lingered on my fingers for a long while. It is possible to become a steward of a thing whether you intend to or not. The jar is an evidence bag for a memory I cannot lose. The sigil remains under my skin. It has not faded. It lies quiet as a coin in my flesh, and when I touch it I can feel a tiny warmth like a buried ember. A surgeon told me a brand could be excised. An old friend suggested tattooing over it to mark it as a voluntary herald. I have done neither. In private, in the late hours, I sometimes rub it and listen to the small private noises of my house, and I measure how much I have allowed the town's logic to change my own gestures. People ask questions in the ways they always do. Was this a hoax? An elaborate set? A mass psychosis? I supply what they can verify. Wood fragments, jars, the collapsed architecture, official logs, a clinical report that says only so much. The rest is filed under anomalous site. I keep a personal folder, labeled in shorthand, for the frames I cannot ethically share. The spiral with its notches that changed while I watched. The moment where my name rose in ink, the image of a child's hand pouring a basin that looked at me like an accusation. Sometimes at night, when the house is quiet and the world contracts into the geometry of one small domestic square, I dream of rows of basins floating in dim rooms and the slow, precise gestures of people who do not look at me. The dreams are not always violent. They are most often procedural. The meticulous filling of cups, the exact returning of spoons to crescent position, the careful notation on the spiral. In my dreams, the town asks me to do nothing more than to sit and tally, to be a willing ledger keeper. In the dreams, I refuse. Then I wake sweating. A strange after effect of watching so carefully is that your eyes keep wanting to reorder the world into patterns. A coffee maker becomes a ring of small basins. The washing machine becomes a hollow drum. I catch myself checking for notches and for names when I walk past old park benches. Once, in a supermarket, a child dropped a ribbon and bent to pick it up in a motion identical to one I saw in that lane. The gesture was automatic, and the child's face never registered me. I felt briefly and potently that the town had not been wholly undone. Habits have a stubbornness that architectures can never fully eliminate. There are nights when I drive out to the ridge and look down into that valley. From up there, the hollow seems ordinary. An empty span of woods and a slow ribbon of water where, once, a lane could be seen winding into a hollow. My car's headlights paint the ground in wide, shallow swipes, and for a few minutes I convince myself the place has returned wholly to wilderness. Then I think of the spiral and its soft, patient counting, and of how names do not simply vanish. They lodge like seeds. A colleague once said, with a dryness that was meant to judge, that the mind finds monsters where it sees order, perhaps. But if there is mercy in that statement, it is slight. The town, whatever it was, did not merely crave order. It had invented a calculus that ate the continuity of people and rewove it into the outline of another body. When I returned to paperwork, when I sat with the forms and the photographs and the methodical boxes, I felt that same calculus waiting in the margins of my sentences like a footnote. If you observe, you are implicated. If you ask me directly now, is it really empty? I will tell you what I told myself and what I have written in both redacted reports and private journals. The settlement, at least on the days I walked through it, was not empty. It was full of process. People walked, spoke, and acted, but their motions fed a structure that sought to create a presence from collected parts. Whether that presence would have been savior or predator, creation or compulsion, I cannot say with scientific authority. I can only say I saw the machine take shape and I struck a blow into its heart. The blow unstitched it for a time. Which brings us to the ethical arithmetic of silence. There is safety in secrecy. There is also cowardice in concealment. I chose, in the end, a middle path. Official documentation enough to flag the site for closure. Private archives kept for posterity. And a lockbox of one jar that I refuse to destroy. Why I keep it I cannot explain rationally. Perhaps it is penance. Perhaps it is evidence. Perhaps it is the human habit of keeping a thing that once nearly took you. I do not urge you to go looking for that hollow. It was not a tourist site, and to pry into processes we do not understand is to risk being folded into their grammar. The ritual of the town, its basins, its spiral, its ledger of names, was not an instruction manual for someone curious. Do not read its motions as a how-to. Read them as a warning. Sometimes late at night, I tie a strip of white cloth loosely about my wrist. Habit again. A gesture that has no power except to steady my hand. I think of a child in that lane balancing a basin. The motion perfected. I think of the innkeeper setting a brass key on a counter and saying simply, with economy, you'll want the room with a basin. I think of quiet voices counting not to keep time but to keep a sum. I think of my name rising, like ink on a page, waiting its turn in a spiral. If you make anything of this aside from curiosity, if you are moved, if a story lodges in you, if the notion of places that are not empty frightens or fascinates, you can leave a thought in the comments. Spell out what you think was taken and what was attempted to be formed. I cannot confirm or deny theories. All I can do is offer the one irrefutable detail. The valley is not and was not simply abandoned. It was occupied by a slow, patient mechanism that used habit as feedstock and names as currency. I will keep my reports in a locked folder on a server and the amber jar in my box. I will keep the photos that I could not publish, and every now and then I will take them out and look to see if the spiral still reads my name. Mostly I try to live a life that does not give the town any more credit than it deserves. But if you ask me at 2 in the morning, with only the hum of your refrigerator for company, whether an abandoned place might be truly empty, I will answer honestly and with the weight of memory. Not always. Some abandonments are full of work. Some are quietly assembling their own idea of a self. I do not offer a tidy moral to close with. The ledger is not closed. Perhaps it never will be. The town's apparatus can be interrupted, as I proved, but not entirely obliterated. Forms of hunger that learn to feed on habit are difficult beasts to kill. All I can do is keep my eyes open. Keep a record clean enough to be believed by those who will look at facts rather than at myth. And keep a jar in a box so that if anyone ever asks where the evidence lies, I can hand it over with a steady face. If you have theories, if you want to suggest what the spiral meant or what the basins sought, write them below. Keep them sensible, keep them curious. There will be more places to explore, and perhaps more questions of whether a site is empty or merely engaged in an occupation of its own devising. For those who enjoy slow burn mysteries, for those who like to imagine that a place can keep working long after people have left, I will be filing more notes and possibly, if I can stomach it, more footage. Subscribe if you want to follow the archive. Tonight, when I lie down and the house organizes itself into shadows, I still sometimes feel the basin's faint echo, a hollow tone that suggests a vessel is waiting to be filled. I check the lockbox, I touch the sigil under my sleeve, and I whisper, more to myself than to anything else, that an empty place is not always empty. Sometimes it is counting, sometimes it is feeding, and sometimes, if you are unlucky enough to notice, it will decide that you are part of the sum.